The porcelain cup shattered against the hearth before Eleanor Whitmore even understood she had thrown it. "You are easily replaced," Julian Ashford, Duke of Harlington, said again, as though the first time had not been cruel enough. He stood by the window of his study, his back straight, his voice flat with the particular coldness he used only when he wanted a thing to end quickly. "I could hire 3 women tomorrow who would do your work twice as well and complain half as much." For 6 years, Eleanor had kept his accounts, answered his letters, managed his tenants' disputes, and remembered the names of every servant's children on their birthdays, because he never could. She had done it all without a title, without a proper wage that matched the work, and without so much as a word of thanks most weeks. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself many things. "Then replace me," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was rather proud of that later, when she had time to be proud of anything. Julian turned from the window, frowning, as though she had spoken in a language he did not know. "Eleanor, you called me easily replaced, Your Grace." She used his title the way one might use a blade, small and precise. "I am simply agreeing with you, and saving us both the trouble of pretending otherwise." She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him say her name once more, sharper this time, the way he spoke to servants who had displeased him. It was that tone, more than anything, that hardened her resolve. She had heard him use it on stable boys and scullery maids. She had never once heard him use it on her before today. She opened the door and shut it behind her without slamming it. A slammed door could be dismissed as a woman's temper. A quietly closed door left no such excuse. The hallway outside was empty except for Mrs. Colette Farrow, the housekeeper, who had clearly been standing near enough to hear most of what passed. Colette's face had gone pale. "Miss Whitmore," she said carefully, "surely you don't mean to—" "I mean exactly what I said, Mrs. Farrow." Eleanor kept walking, her hands folded in front of her to stop them from trembling. "I will have my things packed by morning." "And go where?" Colette hurried to keep pace with her. "You have no family left in this county. You have given this house 6 years of your life." "I am aware of what I have given this house." Eleanor stopped at the base of the stairs and finally allowed herself one long breath, "which is precisely why I intend to leave before it takes anything more." That night, she did not cry, though she had expected to. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, the same desk where she had drafted 1,000 letters in Julian's name, and she began instead to draft one in her own. She wrote to her aunt, Beatrice Whitmore, who kept a small but respectable boarding house in the market town of Ashcombe, some 30 miles east. She wrote that she required a room, that she could pay her way through honest work, and that she would explain everything when she arrived. She did not write that her heart had cracked somewhere between the word replaced and the sound of the door closing. Some things did not need to be written to be true. By dawn, her trunk was packed. It held far less than 6 years should have accumulated, which told its own quiet story about how little she had ever asked for herself. The Duke's household woke slowly, as it always did, unaware that anything had changed until the change was already finished. Eleanor did not wait to be seen off. She hired a cart from the village and left before the kitchen fires were even lit, before the stable boys had let out the horses, before Julian Ashford had likely opened his eyes. She did not look back at Harlington Hall as the cart pulled away. She had spent enough years looking at it, memorizing its stone and its ivy and its cold, beautiful windows. She had no wish to carry one more image of it with her now. It was nearly noon when Julian realized she was gone. He had expected her at his study door by 9, as she always was, with the morning's correspondence sorted into neat piles and a brief, efficient summary of anything requiring his attention. When 9 came and went, he assumed she was sulking, which irritated him. When 10 came and went, he sent a footman to fetch her, which irritated him further, because a duke should not have to fetch anyone. It was the footman's stammering report that Miss Whitmore's room stood empty, her trunk gone, her bed made with a precision that suggested she did not intend to return to it, that finally cracked something in his composure. "Gone where?" he demanded. The footman did not know, nor did the stable boys, who had not seen her leave, nor did the cook, who had noticed only that the morning's bread had been sliced and left out for the staff, as Eleanor always did before any early errand, a small habit of care that suddenly seemed unbearably loud in its absence. It was Colette Farrow, finally, who told him the truth, standing in the doorway of his study, with her hands folded and her jaw set in a way that made it clear she blamed him entirely. "She has left, Your Grace. I believe you told her she was easily replaced. She appears to have taken you at your word." Julian said nothing for a long moment. He looked, Colette would later tell the other servants, like a man who had been struck, and was still deciding whether it had actually hurt. "She will come back," he said finally. "Women in her position always do. She has nowhere else to go." Colette did not answer that. She simply turned and left the room, and something about her silence unsettled him more than an argument would have. He told himself, over the following days, that the house ran perfectly well without Eleanor Whitmore. He told himself this while searching for a letter she would have found in seconds. He told himself this while sitting through a tenant dispute without her quiet notes reminding him which family had lost a child to fever last winter and needed gentler handling. He told himself this while eating a dinner that tasted flat, though the cook swore nothing in the kitchen had changed. By the end of the first week, he had stopped telling himself anything at all, because it had become difficult to believe. He did not go after her. His pride would not permit it, not yet, and perhaps not for a long while. A duke did not chase after a companion who had spoken to him with such disrespect, regardless of how true her words might have been, regardless of the strange, hollow quiet that had settled over Harlington Hall since her departure. Instead, he sent word to his solicitor to begin the search for a new companion to manage his household affairs. Someone efficient, someone unremarkable, someone who would not leave gaps shaped exactly like themselves in every room they had once occupied. He did not yet understand that some gaps could not be filled by hiring a replacement, because they had never truly been about the work at all. 30 miles east, in a small room above her aunt's boarding house, Eleanor Whitmore unpacked her trunk, hung her 3 dresses in a narrow wardrobe, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 years, to imagine a life that did not orbit entirely around another person's needs. It was frightening. It was also, she found, rather freeing. Her Aunt Beatrice, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair and no patience for self-pity, watched her from the doorway with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and suspicion. "You look like a woman who has just set down something very heavy," Beatrice said. "I have," Eleanor admitted. "Good." Beatrice nodded once, as though that settled the matter entirely. "Then don't you dare pick it back up again just because your arms feel strange without it." Eleanor did not answer, but she turned to the small window of her new room and looked out at a street she did not recognize, filled with people who did not know her name, in a town where no one expected her to remember anyone's birthday, or manage anyone's accounts, or absorb anyone's careless cruelty, simply because she had grown used to doing so. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future felt like something that belonged to her. That evening, Beatrice set a plate of bread and cheese before her and sat across the small table, studying her niece with the frank attention of someone who had raised no children of her own, but had opinions about everyone else's. "Tell me about him," Beatrice said, "the Duke." "There is nothing to tell." Eleanor broke off a piece of bread she had no real appetite for. "He is a duke. He believes the world exists to be managed by him and serve him in equal measure, and for 6 years I confirmed that belief by managing and serving him without complaint. And now? Now I intend to stop." Beatrice's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. It is easier said in a warm kitchen 30 miles from his house than it will be said again, should you ever find yourself standing in front of him. "I do not intend to stand in front of him again." "No," Beatrice agreed, in the tone of someone who did not believe a word of it. "I'm sure you don't." Eleanor let the comment pass. She was too tired, too raw, to argue a point she was not entirely certain of herself. Instead, she asked about the boarding house, about the guests who came through. Merchants, traveling clergy, the occasional family passing to visit relatives in the north. And let her aunt talk until the fire burned low and her own eyes grew heavy. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed under an unfamiliar roof, Eleanor found that sleep did not come easily. She kept hearing the words again, easily replaced, and beneath them, quieter, her own voice answering. "Then replace me." She had surprised herself as much as she had surprised him. She had not planned to say it. It had simply risen out of 6 years of swallowed words all at once, demanding to be spoken before she lost her nerve. She wondered, briefly, whether he had already forgotten her, whether some new companion was even now seated at her old desk, sorting his letters into piles he would barely glance at. The thought stung more than she wanted to admit, and she was almost grateful for the sting, because it meant she had not yet gone entirely numb. She rose before dawn out of habit, dressed, and went down to find Beatrice already awake, kneading dough for the morning's guests. "You needn't help," Beatrice said, without looking up. "You are not staff here." "I would rather have something to do with my hands," Eleanor said, and took up an apron without waiting for permission. They worked together in comfortable silence, and Eleanor found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not mind the flour under her nails or the ache in her shoulders by mid-morning. It was honest work, chosen freely, owed to no one who would call her easily replaced for doing it well. By the time the first guests came down for breakfast, Eleanor Whitmore had already decided something important, though she could not yet have put it into words. She was not simply surviving her departure from Harlington Hall. She was beginning, however slowly, to build something that was entirely her own. She did not yet know how far Julian Ashford's pride would have to fall before he understood what he had actually lost. She only knew that whatever happened next, she would not be the one waiting at his door. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Julian Ashford read it 3 times before he understood why his hands had gone still. It was not from Eleanor. It was from his own solicitor, informing him with careful, formal regret that the quarterly accounts submitted to the county magistrate contained an error significant enough to draw attention. A miscalculation in tenant rents that Eleanor Whitmore had, for 6 years, quietly caught and corrected before any document left the house. No one had caught it this time. No one had thought to look, because no one had known to look. Because the woman who had always looked was 30 miles away, kneading bread in her aunt's kitchen. Julian sat at his desk long after the letter had gone still in his hands, staring at numbers that suddenly seemed to mock him. Harlington Hall, in the weeks since Eleanor's departure, had not collapsed. Julian had told himself it would not, and in the most visible ways he had been right. The dinners were still served. The fires were still lit. The tenants still bowed when he rode past. But underneath the surface of things, small failures had begun to accumulate like dust in a room no one thought to sweep. A letter to a bishop's wife had gone out addressed with the wrong honorific, causing a minor and entirely avoidable offense. A tenant's roof, which should have been repaired weeks earlier according to a schedule Eleanor had always kept in her head and on paper both, had instead collapsed in a storm, leaving a family of 5 without proper shelter, until Julian's steward finally noticed the oversight. A birthday, the young daughter of his head groundskeeper, had passed unmarked for the first time in years, and the groundskeeper's quiet disappointment had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the staff, who whispered about it in the kitchens in a way that somehow always reached Julian's ears just late enough to be useless. None of these things, alone, would have troubled him greatly. Together, they formed a pattern he could not ignore, however much he wished to. He had hired a new companion within a fortnight of Eleanor's departure, a sensible young woman named Charlotte Vane, recommended by a family friend as capable and discreet. Charlotte was, by every reasonable measure, competent. She kept tidy records. She answered correspondence promptly. She did not argue with him, which he had initially counted as an improvement. He was beginning to understand that it was not. Charlotte Vane did not know that the Hargrove family's eldest son had been ill last winter and required gentler terms on his father's rent. She did not know that Lady Price, his aunt, preferred her letters delivered before noon, or she would complain for a week. She did not know the names of the tenants' children, the small kindnesses that cost nothing but meant everything to the people who received them, the quiet architecture of care that Eleanor had built around his household without ever once asking for credit. Charlotte Vane simply did the work in front of her, competently and without feeling, and Julian found himself, more and more often, comparing her efficient blankness to a warmth he had apparently only noticed after losing it. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," Charlotte said one afternoon, setting a stack of letters before him with brisk precision. "I am considering a great many things," Julian said, which was true, though not in the way she likely assumed. He was considering, for instance, how strange it was that a house full of servants and staff could feel emptier than it had when only one particular person had occupied a modest room on the 2nd floor. He was considering how often, in the quiet hour before dinner, he found himself glancing toward the study door out of some old habit, expecting to see Eleanor there with her neat piles of correspondence and her dry, unimpressed observations about whichever tenant dispute had ruined his morning. He was considering, though he would not have admitted it aloud to a single soul, that he missed arguing with her more than he had ever enjoyed agreeing with anyone else. His aunt, Lady Augusta Price, arrived at Harlington Hall 3 weeks after Eleanor's departure, ostensibly to discuss an upcoming family matter, but in truth, Julian suspected, to see for herself whether the rumors reaching her in London held any truth. Augusta was a formidable woman, sharp-tongued and entirely unafraid of her nephew's title, and she wasted no time getting to the point once she had settled into the drawing room with a cup of tea she did not particularly want. "You have lost Miss Whitmore," she said, not as a question. "I have not lost anything," Julian said. "She chose to leave. After you told her she was easily replaced, I understand." Augusta's eyebrows rose slightly. A curious choice of words for a woman who has run this household more capably than any housekeeper you've employed in a decade. She was insolent. She was honest. which you have apparently confused for the same thing. Augusta set down her cup with a small, decisive click. Julian, I have known you since you were a boy who cried when his favorite horse was sold, and I have never once seen you look as unsettled as you do now, over a companion you claim meant nothing to you. Julian said nothing. There was nothing convincing he could say, and his aunt, more than most people, would recognize a lie the instant it left his mouth. Where has she gone? Augusta asked, more gently now. I don't know, Julian admitted. I did not ask. Then perhaps, Augusta said, rising to smooth her skirts, you ought to consider why a man who insists a person meant nothing to him has spent 3 weeks failing to notice that his entire household has quietly begun to fall apart in her absence. She left him alone with that thought, and it sat with him long after she had gone, uncomfortable and impossible to dismiss. That night, unable to sleep, Julian walked the halls of Harlington Hall alone, past the small room that had once been Eleanor's, now stripped bare and reassigned to no one in particular, as though the household itself had not yet decided what to do with the space she had left behind. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the empty desk by the window where she had once sat drafting his letters, correcting his errors, quietly holding together a life he had never properly thanked her for helping him live. He thought of the words he had said to her, easily replaced, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider that he had not meant them the way they had sounded. He had been irritated that morning over some small matter he could no longer even recall, and he had reached for the cruelest available words simply because they were within reach, never imagining she might actually believe them, never imagining she might leave. It occurred to him, standing in that empty room, that a man who could not remember what had made him angry enough to say something so unforgivable had perhaps not deserved the years of patience that preceded it. He did not write to her that night. His pride, still bruised and stubborn, would not yet permit it. But he found, when he finally returned to his own chambers, that sleep came a little easier once he had admitted, if only to himself, that he had been wrong. 30 miles east, Eleanor Whitmore had no knowledge of any of this. She spent her days learning the rhythms of her aunt's boarding house, discovering a quiet satisfaction in work that asked only what she was willing to give and never more. She had begun helping with the accounts, a skill she possessed in abundance, and one that quickly made her indispensable to Beatrice, in ways that felt entirely different from her years at Harlington Hall. Here, when she corrected an error or caught an overlooked expense, Beatrice thanked her plainly, without condescension, without the assumption that such competence was simply owed. It was a small thing. It changed everything. She had also begun, in her spare hours, tutoring the innkeeper's daughter in reading and simple arithmetic, a task she found unexpectedly rewarding. Watching a child's understanding bloom under patient instruction reminded her that she had value beyond the narrow role she had occupied for 6 years, value that had nothing to do with any duke's household or any duke's opinion of her usefulness. She thought of Julian rarely, she told herself, though the frequency with which she caught herself thinking of him suggested otherwise. She wondered some evenings whether Harlington Hall still ran as smoothly without her, whether Charlotte Vane, she had heard the name mentioned once, in a letter from a former colleague among the staff, had settled comfortably into the role that had once been hers. She told herself she hoped it had. She told herself this rather more often than the truth of her feelings actually warranted, and some nights, lying awake in her small room above the boarding house, she allowed herself the honest and uncomfortable admission that some part of her wanted Harlington Hall to struggle without her, wanted Julian Ashford to understand precisely what he had discarded so carelessly. It was not a kind thought. She did not entirely regret having it. By the end of the 2nd month, Eleanor had settled into a rhythm that felt, if not yet joyful, at least steady, and entirely her own. She had begun to smile more easily. She had begun to sleep through the night without the ghost of a cold voice saying easily replaced echoing through her thoughts. She did not yet know that 30 miles away, a duke stood in an empty room each evening, staring at a desk that had once been hers, slowly and painfully understanding exactly how wrong he had been. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the boarding house addressed to Beatrice, but the handwriting on the outer fold was familiar enough that Eleanor's breath caught before she even opened it. It was not from Julian. It was from Colette Farrow, the housekeeper, who had apparently written to an old acquaintance in the village and learned, through a chain of gossip that stretched further than Eleanor would have guessed, exactly where she had gone. Colette's letter was warm and full of news Eleanor had told herself she did not want. The roof that had gone unrepaired, the bishop's wife who had taken offense at a misaddressed letter, the groundskeeper's daughter whose birthday had passed unmarked, a detail that struck Eleanor harder than she expected, because she had kept a small record of every child's birthday in that household for 6 years, precisely so such a thing would never happen. She read the letter twice, sitting at the small table in her room, and felt an unwelcome tangle of feelings rise in her chest. There was a flicker of vindication, sharp and not entirely admirable. There was also something softer and more painful, a genuine ache for a household she had cared for despite everything, for people who had done nothing wrong except depend on a system that had quietly relied on her far more than anyone had ever acknowledged. She folded the letter carefully and did not answer it that day. She was not yet ready to know whether her silence was strength or simply fear dressed in a more respectable name. That evening, Beatrice found her staring out the window long after the guests had gone up to bed, and settled into the chair across from her without being asked. "Bad news?" Beatrice asked. "Not bad. Exactly." Eleanor turned the folded letter over in her hands. "Only news I did not expect to affect me as much as it has. The Duke's household is struggling without you," Beatrice said, not as a question. When Eleanor looked up, startled, her aunt simply shrugged. "You have that particular expression women wear when they've just discovered they were more necessary than anyone ever told them." "It should not please me," Eleanor admitted quietly. "And yet some small, ungenerous part of me is glad. There is nothing ungenerous about wanting your worth to be seen, even in its absence." Beatrice reached across and patted her hand once, briskly, the closest thing to open affection she typically allowed herself. "The question is not whether you are glad, the question is what you intend to do about it." "Nothing," Eleanor said. "I intend to do nothing at all." "Good." Beatrice rose, satisfied, and moved toward the door. "See that you mean it this time, rather than simply hoping he'll prove you wrong." Eleanor sat alone with that thought for a long while after her aunt had gone. She was building something new here, something honest and entirely her own, built on work freely chosen rather than duty quietly assumed. She did not want Julian Ashford's regret. She did not want to lie awake wondering whether he thought of her at all. And yet she did, some nights, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it, even as she resolved not to act on it. The following week brought a small crisis of her own at the boarding house, a merchant guest who disputed his bill loudly enough to draw the attention of every other guest at breakfast, insisting he had been overcharged when in truth he simply could not read Beatrice's careful handwriting. Eleanor stepped in without being asked, walked the man through each line of the account with patient clarity, and resolved the matter within minutes, leaving him embarrassed but satisfied, and Beatrice quietly impressed. "You have a gift for making difficult men feel heard without ever once backing down," Beatrice observed afterward, watching the merchant depart with his temper fully restored. "I had a great deal of practice," Eleanor said dryly, and for the first time in weeks, she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and easy, and it surprised her how good it felt to mean it. She did not yet know how far Julian Ashford's pride would have to fall before he understood what he had actually lost. She only knew that for the first time in years, her days belonged to no one but herself, and that knowledge, however small, felt like the beginning of something she had never quite dared to want before. The fire spread through the eastern tenant cottages before anyone at Harlington Hall even smelled the smoke. It was Charlotte Vane who brought Julian the news, breathless and pale, having ridden back from the village herself rather than sending a servant, which told him immediately that the situation was worse than she wanted to say aloud. "3 families," she said. "The Hargroves lost nearly everything. The blaze started in a hay store that should have been moved weeks ago, according to the old schedule, but no one—" She stopped herself, but Julian understood the rest of the sentence perfectly well. No one had thought to move it because the person who had always tracked such details was no longer there to remind anyone. He rode out immediately, and what he found in the village turned his stomach in a way few things had in his adult life. The Hargrove family stood in the road in their nightclothes, their youngest child clutching a single scorched blanket, watching what remained of their home smolder in the gray morning light. 2 other families stood nearby in similarly shattered states, their possessions reduced to what they had managed to carry out in a panic. No one had died. Julian would be grateful for that fact for the rest of his life. But the fire had exposed, in the cruelest possible way, exactly how much had quietly slipped through the cracks since Eleanor Whitmore's departure. The hay store should have been relocated at the end of summer, according to a schedule Eleanor had maintained in a small leather notebook that Julian now realized he had never once looked at himself, trusting entirely that she would simply handle it, as she handled everything. Charlotte Vane, competent as she was in matters of correspondence and accounts, had never been told the notebook existed. No one had thought to tell her. No one had thought at all about the dozens of small, unglamorous tasks that had kept Harlington Hall's tenants safe and cared for, because those tasks had always simply happened, quietly, in the background of a household that had taken Eleanor's diligence entirely for granted. Julian spent the day organizing emergency shelter for the displaced families, drawing on funds and resources with the swift authority only a duke could command, and by evening, the immediate crisis had been addressed, if not resolved. The Hargroves and their neighbors had warm beds in the servants' quarters of the hall itself, food, and Julian's assurance that new cottages would be built before winter. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough, even as he offered it. He had failed these families through negligence that traced directly back to his own carelessness, his own pride, his own refusal to acknowledge how much of his household's smooth functioning had depended on one woman he had discarded over a moment's irritation. That night, alone in his study, Julian sat with Eleanor's old leather notebook, recovered finally from a drawer no one had thought to search, and read through pages of her careful, precise handwriting. Schedules for repairs, notes on which families needed gentler terms and why, birthdays, illnesses, small kindnesses recorded and tracked with a diligence that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with genuine care. He found, near the back of the notebook, a page dated some months before her departure, listing improvements she believed the estate needed: better drainage for the eastern fields, repairs to 3-tenant roofs, a proper schedule for moving flammable stores away from the cottages before the dry season. He had never seen this page. He had never asked to see it. He had simply assumed such concerns were beneath his direct attention, the sort of detail a competent companion handled without troubling him. He had been wrong about so many things. Lady Augusta Price arrived again within the week, summoned by news of the fire that had apparently traveled to London faster than Julian would have liked. She toured the temporary shelter in the servants' quarters, spoke gently to the Hargrove children, and found her nephew afterward in his study, staring at Eleanor's notebook with an expression Augusta had never seen on his face before. "You look," she said carefully, settling into the chair across from his desk, like a man finally understanding the cost of his own arrogance. "I have been reading her notes," Julian said, not looking up. "Everything I failed to notice is written here, in her hand, months before any of it happened. She warned me, in her own way. I never read a word of it because I never thought to ask what she was thinking about beyond the tasks directly in front of her." "Because you saw her as staff," Augusta said, not unkindly, "rather than as a person with judgment worth consulting." Yes, the admission cost him something visible, a slight tightening around his eyes. "I told her she was easily replaced, because some small, ugly part of me resented how much I depended on her. It felt safer to diminish her than to admit how essential she had become to every corner of my life." Augusta was quiet for a long moment, studying her nephew with an expression that mixed exasperation with something gentler. "And now 3 families have lost their homes because of that resentment." "Yes," Julian said again, and the word felt heavier each time he spoke it. "What do you intend to do?" "I don't know." He closed the notebook carefully, as though it were something fragile. "I cannot simply write to her and expect forgiveness for a fire she had nothing to do with, caused entirely by my own failure to value what she gave this household. That would be its own kind of arrogance, expecting her to solve a problem I created by driving her away." "No," Augusta agreed. "It would not be well received, I imagine, if that were your intention. Miss Whitmore struck me, in the brief time I knew her, as a woman with considerably more self-respect than to return, simply because you finally noticed her absence was inconvenient." Julian looked up sharply. "Then what would you have me do?" "Fix what you can fix, Julian, without expecting her to fix it for you." Augusta rose, smoothing her skirts with brisk finality. "Rebuild the cottages properly. Learn what is actually in that notebook rather than simply admiring her handwriting. Become the kind of man who deserves an apology to be accepted, before you ever presume to offer one." She left him alone with the notebook and a study that felt colder than it had in years, and Julian sat long into the night, reading every page by candlelight, beginning at last to understand the full architecture of care that Eleanor Whitmore had built around him, without ever once asking for recognition. In the weeks that followed, Julian threw himself into rebuilding the eastern cottages with an intensity that surprised his staff and unsettled Charlotte Vane, who found herself increasingly relegated to correspondence alone, as Julian personally reviewed every repair schedule, every tenant concern, every small detail Eleanor's notebook had recorded, and he had previously ignored. He was not, he told himself, doing this to win her back. He was doing this because it was owed, plainly and simply, to families who had suffered for his negligence. If some part of him hoped that word of his efforts might eventually reach 30 miles east, to a small room above a boarding house in Ashcombe, he did not examine that hope too closely. Charlotte Vane, for her part, watched her employer's transformation with a mixture of professional confusion and quiet, growing unease. She had been hired to fill a role, and she had filled it competently, by every reasonable standard. But she was beginning to understand that the role itself had been built around a person, around Eleanor Whitmore's particular judgment and care, in ways that could not simply be transferred to a new occupant no matter how diligently that occupant worked. "Your Grace," she said one afternoon, finding him once again bent over Eleanor's notebook rather than the correspondence she had prepared for his attention. "May I ask you something directly?" "You may." "Do you wish me to continue in this position?" Charlotte's voice was steady, professional, but something beneath it suggested she already suspected the answer. "I have done everything asked of me. I have made no errors that I am aware of, and yet I cannot help but notice that you consult a dead woman's, forgive me, a departed woman's notebook more often than you consult me." Julian looked up, and for a moment, guilt flickered plainly across his face. "That is unfair to you, Miss Vane. You have done nothing wrong." "No," Charlotte agreed. "I have done nothing wrong. And it has made no difference at all, has it? Because the position was never truly about doing the work correctly. It was about caring for this house and its people the way she did, and that is not something that can be taught from a notebook, however detailed." Julian did not answer immediately, and his silence was answer enough. "I will finish out my notice properly," Charlotte said, with quiet dignity. "But I think we both know I was never going to be the one to fill this particular gap, Your Grace. Some positions are not truly positions at all. They are simply a person, doing what only they know how to do, and no one else can step into shoes shaped so precisely by someone else's care." She left his study with her composure intact, and Julian sat alone afterward, struck by how thoroughly a stranger had just articulated, in a handful of sentences, exactly what he had spent weeks failing to admit to himself. He was not looking for a replacement. He had never needed a replacement. He had needed Eleanor Whitmore, specifically and irreplaceably, and no notebook, however carefully kept, could substitute for the woman who had written it out of genuine care for people he had barely troubled himself to notice. He filled 2 pages before he stopped, reread what he had written, and felt his face grow hot with embarrassment at his own clumsiness. The words sounded exactly like what they were: a proud man attempting, for the first time in his life, to apologize properly, and finding that he had no practice at it whatsoever. He had apologized before, of course, the small social apologies that cost nothing and meant less. He had never apologized for something that actually mattered, to someone whose good opinion he had only recently understood he desperately wanted. He folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where Eleanor's notebook had been hidden for weeks, and told himself he would try again tomorrow, when his thoughts were clearer. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it brought no rest. He dreamed, absurdly, of the empty desk by the window in Eleanor's old room, except in the dream the desk was not empty at all. She sat there as she always had, sorting letters with quick, capable hands, glancing up at him with the faint, dry amusement she had so often worn when he complained about some minor inconvenience. He woke before she could speak, the image dissolving into gray morning light, and lay still for a long moment, feeling the particular ache of having lost something twice in one night. He rose early and rode out to the eastern cottages before breakfast, as had become his habit, and found the Hargrove family already awake, the father directing 2 laborers in setting the first new timber frame, while his wife watched with cautious hope on her tired face. Julian dismounted and helped without being asked, hauling timber alongside men who had never expected to see a duke with dirt under his fingernails, and found, in the honest labor of it, a kind of relief from thoughts that otherwise circled endlessly back to a woman 30 miles away. The youngest Hargrove child, a girl of perhaps 5, watched him work with wide, solemn eyes, before finally approaching to ask, with the blunt honesty only children possessed, whether he was truly a duke, because dukes in her storybooks did not usually have splinters in their hands. "I am," Julian said, crouching to her level, "though I confess the storybooks may have exaggerated how clean our hands generally stay." The girl considered this seriously, then asked whether he knew Miss Whitmore, who used to visit and always brought sweets and remembered everyone's birthday. Julian's chest tightened at the question, delivered so innocently, and he told the girl, honestly, that he had known Miss Whitmore very well, and that he missed her a great deal. "Then you should write to her," the girl said, with the simple logic of a child who had not yet learned that adults complicated such things unnecessarily. That's what my mother says to do when you miss someone and you were unkind to them. You write and say sorry, and you mean it properly, not just the fast kind of sorry. Julian found himself oddly moved by this, and told the girl she had given him excellent advice, better than any he had received from adults considerably older and more experienced than herself. News of the fire reached Ashcombe nearly a week later, carried by a traveling merchant who stopped at Beatrice's boarding house and spoke of it over dinner, unaware that one of the women serving his meal had spent 6 years managing the very estate he described. Eleanor stood very still when she heard the merchant mention Harlington by name, her hands full of dishes, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. "Terrible business," the merchant said between mouthfuls, oblivious to the effect his words were having. "3 families burned out entirely. I heard the young Duke has thrown himself into rebuilding with his own hands, practically, working alongside the laborers rather than simply paying for it and looking away, which is more than most of his kind would bother to do." "Was anyone hurt?" Eleanor asked, and was relieved to hear her own voice come out steady. "Not seriously, praise heaven, though I heard it might have been avoided altogether if someone had thought to move the hay stores before the season turned. Some say the household lost its steadiest hand some months back and has been fumbling about since." Eleanor set down the dishes very carefully and excused herself before her expression could betray anything further. She spent that night unable to sleep, replaying the merchant's words over and over. The Hargrove family, she knew them well, had visited their cottage countless times over the years, had held their youngest child as an infant when the mother took ill one winter. She knew exactly which hay store the merchant meant, because she had written the schedule herself, had warned Julian in her notes precisely because she understood the danger of leaving it too long into the dry season. Guilt and anger tangled together uncomfortably in her chest. Guilt, because some part of her irrationally felt she should have been there to prevent it, though she knew perfectly well the fault lay entirely with a household that had failed to value her warnings even while she was present, let alone after she had gone. Anger, because that same household, because Julian himself, had dismissed exactly the kind of careful attention that might have spared a family their home, simply because he had never bothered to see it as anything more than a duty owed to him. She rose before dawn again, as she often did now, and found Beatrice already in the kitchen. "You look as though you haven't slept," Beatrice observed. "I heard news of Harlington last night. A fire. 3 families lost their homes." Eleanor took up an apron with hands that were not quite steady. "The Hargroves. I knew that family well." Beatrice studied her for a long moment. "And what do you intend to do about it?" "Nothing," Eleanor said, echoing her own words from weeks before, though this time they felt considerably less certain in her mouth. "There is nothing I can do. I am no longer part of that household." "You could write to the housekeeper," Beatrice suggested carefully, "not to him, simply to ask after the family's welfare, as any decent person might, given your history with them." Eleanor considered this for the rest of the morning, and by afternoon she had written a brief, careful letter to Colette Farrow, asking only after the Hargrove children's welfare, and offering, from her own modest savings, a small sum toward whatever the family might need that Julian's efforts had not yet covered. She made no mention of Julian himself. She asked for no news of him and requested that none be given. Colette's reply arrived within the week, warm and grateful, assuring Eleanor that the Hargroves were safely housed and that new cottages were already under construction, funded entirely by the Duke, who had apparently been working alongside the laborers himself, with a diligence no one in the household had ever witnessed from him before. Colette added, almost as an afterthought, that His Grace had been asking after Eleanor's notebook rather often, and seemed, in the housekeeper's careful phrasing, considerably changed since the spring. Eleanor read this last line several times before folding the letter away, unwilling to examine too closely why her chest felt tight in reading it. She sent her small contribution toward the Hargrove family's needs, refused Colette's offer to mention the gift source to anyone at the hall, and told herself firmly that her curiosity about Julian's supposed transformation was simply concern for the tenants she had once cared for, nothing more. She was not entirely certain she believed herself. That night, for the first time since her departure, Julian Ashford sat down and began to write a letter he did not send. The letter Julian finally sent was 3 sentences long, and he rewrote it 11 times before allowing himself to seal it. He did not ask Eleanor to return. He did not apologize at length, or attempt to explain away the cruelty of the words he had spoken in his study months earlier. He wrote only that the Hargrove family's new cottages were nearly finished, that her notebook had taught him more about his own household than 6 years of living in it ever had, and that he would be attending the autumn assembly in Ashcombe, should she wish to know. It was not an apology. It was, he told himself, an opening, the smallest possible door left ajar, which she could choose to walk through or ignore entirely, without any pressure from him either way. Eleanor read the letter twice at the small writing desk in her room, then set it aside and did not touch it again for 3 days, though she thought of little else in that time. "You're going to that assembly," Beatrice said one evening, not quite a question, watching her niece stare into the middle distance over a plate of untouched supper. "I have not decided." "You have decided," Beatrice said, with the particular confidence of a woman who had known her niece since childhood. "You are simply pretending you haven't, because deciding feels like admitting something you're not ready to admit." Eleanor did not argue the point, because she suspected her aunt was entirely correct. The Ashcombe Autumn Assembly was a modest affair by the standards of London society, but it drew every respectable family within a day's travel, filling the small assembly rooms with candlelight, music, and the particular nervous energy of a community eager for entertainment after a long harvest season. Eleanor arrived in a pale green gown that Beatrice had insisted on having altered for the occasion, her hair arranged simply but carefully, and told herself repeatedly that she attended only because she deserved a pleasant evening, not because a certain letter had mentioned a certain assembly. She was lying to herself, and she knew it, and she attended anyway. Julian arrived later than most, having ridden the full day's distance from Harlington Hall, and paused just inside the entrance of the assembly rooms, scanning the crowd with an intensity that drew more than one curious glance from the assembled company, who were unaccustomed to seeing a duke look quite so uncertain. He found her near the refreshment table, in conversation with a young clergyman's wife, laughing at something the woman had said, her whole face lit with an ease he had rarely seen from her during her years at Harlington Hall. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had never once been told she was easily replaced, and something in his chest twisted painfully at the sight. He crossed the room before he could think better of it. "Miss Whitmore." Eleanor turned, and whatever composure she had gathered over 3 days of preparation faltered slightly at the sight of him, thinner than she remembered, a faint scar on his hand she did not recognize, likely from the labor of rebuilding cottages himself, and an expression on his face that bore no resemblance to the cold detachment she had last seen across his study. "Your Grace," she inclined her head with careful politeness, "I did not expect you to actually come. I said I would attend, and I keep my word when I remember to give it properly." He hesitated, glancing at the clergyman's wife, who tactfully excused herself with a knowing smile. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Eleanor considered refusing, considered the satisfaction of walking away exactly as she had walked away from his study months earlier, but curiosity, and something warmer and harder to name, won out over pride. A moment, no more. They found a quieter corner near the tall windows, away from the dancing, and for a long moment neither spoke, the silence between them heavier with unsaid things than either seemed willing to break first. "I have thought a great deal about what I said to you," Julian began finally, his voice lower and less certain than the commanding tone she remembered. "I have had months to consider it, and I find I have no adequate excuse. I was angry over something trivial that I cannot even properly recall, and I reached for the cruelest words available, because I resented how much I had come to rely on you, and it felt safer to diminish you than to admit that dependence." Eleanor said nothing, watching him carefully, unwilling to make this easy simply because he had finally found the words. "I read your notebook," he continued. "Every page. I understood, far too late, exactly how much care you put into work I never once properly acknowledged. The Hargrove fire happened because I never bothered to learn what you already knew, because I assumed such knowledge existed simply to serve my convenience, without cost to you, without effort on your part. It cost a great deal," Eleanor said quietly. 6 years of it. "I know," Julian's jaw tightened. "I know that now, though I am ashamed it took your absence, and a fire, and a 5-year-old child's advice to finally understand it." Despite herself, Eleanor's mouth twitched. "A child's advice?" "The youngest Hargrove girl told me that when you have been unkind to someone you miss, you ought to write and apologize properly, not just the fast kind of sorry." A faint, rueful smile crossed his face. "She is, I believe, considerably wiser than I have managed to be in 30 years of living." Eleanor found herself studying him in the candlelight, searching for the cold, dismissive man who had spoken those cruel words in his study, and finding instead someone who looked genuinely worn by months of regret, someone who had rebuilt cottages with his own hands and read a departed companion's notebook until he understood every quiet kindness she had ever offered his household without asking for thanks. It was not enough, not yet, but it was, she allowed, a beginning. I am not the same woman who left your study that morning, she said finally. I have built something of my own since then, something I am not willing to simply set aside because you have finally noticed what you lost. I would not ask you to. Julian's voice was steady now, earnest in a way she had never heard from him before. I have no right to ask you for anything at all, Miss Whitmore. I came tonight only to say what I should have said months ago, properly, and to let you decide what, if anything, you wish to do with it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, the music and candlelight and murmured conversations of the assembly rooms fading into background noise around them. Thank you for the apology, she said finally. It is more than I expected, and considerably more than you offered when you had the chance in your own study. Does that mean? It means I have heard you, Eleanor said, cutting him off gently but firmly. It does not mean I have decided anything further. You spent 6 years assuming my loyalty was owed to you, simply because I gave it freely. I will not make the mistake of assuming your regret owes me anything either, beyond what you have already offered tonight. Julian absorbed this with visible difficulty, but he nodded, accepting the boundary she had drawn without argument, which surprised her more than his apology had. May I write to you? He asked, not to press for anything, simply to keep you informed of the tenants you cared for, if nothing else. Eleanor considered this for a long moment before answering. You may write, she said finally. I make no promise of what I will do with your letters. It was not forgiveness, it was not the door thrown open wide, but it was, both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, no longer entirely shut. Julian did not leave the assembly immediately. He remained near the edges of the room for another hour, watching Eleanor dance with a young solicitor's clerk and later with the clergyman's brother, both perfectly respectable partners who made her laugh in a way that sent an unwelcome twist of jealousy through him, sharper than he had expected and harder to master. He had no right to that jealousy. He reminded himself of this fact several times, with limited success. Beatrice found him standing alone near the windows during a lull in the music, and studied him with the same frank, assessing look she had turned on her niece countless times over the past months. You must be the Duke, she said, without preamble. I am, madam, though I confess I am at a disadvantage. Beatrice Whitmore, Eleanor's aunt. She did not offer a curtsy, and Julian found himself oddly grateful for the omission, weary as he was of formalities that meant nothing. I have heard a great deal about you these past months, none of it, I confess, particularly flattering. I imagine I earned every word of it. You did. Beatrice's tone remained perfectly pleasant, despite the bluntness of her words. My niece gave your household 6 years of devotion that went almost entirely unrecognized, and you repaid her with cruelty the moment it suited your temper. I do not say this to wound you, your grace. I say it because I suspect you already know it, and pretending otherwise between us would waste both our time. Julian inclined his head, accepting the rebuke without protest. You are correct on every point. Good. Beatrice's expression softened very slightly. Then perhaps you are not entirely the fool I feared you might be. Eleanor is happy here, your grace. Truly happy, for the first time in longer than I care to admit. She has built a life that owes nothing to your household or your name. If you intend to pursue whatever it is you came here tonight to pursue, you had better be prepared to earn a place in the life she has built, rather than expecting her to abandon it and return to the one you offered her before. I have no intention of asking her to abandon anything, Julian said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it entirely. I came only to apologize properly. Whatever happens beyond that will be entirely her choice. Beatrice studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the sincerity of his words against months of accumulated skepticism, and finally gave a small, reluctant nod. See that you remember you said that, your grace, in the months ahead. Words spoken in a ballroom have a way of losing their conviction once a man returns to his comfortable estate and forgets the cost of keeping them. She left him with that warning, and Julian rode home the following morning, turning her words over in his mind, determined, whatever else happened, not to prove her right. Eleanor, for her part, spent the days following the assembly in a state of quiet, unsettled distraction that even Beatrice's teasing could not entirely dislodge. She found herself thinking of the conversation by the window more often than she wished to admit, replaying Julian's words, searching them for insincerity, and finding, uncomfortably, none that she could identify. You are doing that thing again, Beatrice observed one morning, watching her niece stare at a column of figures she had not actually added in several minutes. The thing where your hands are busy and your mind is 30 miles away in a Duke's study. I am simply tired, Eleanor said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was not the whole truth either. Tired women do not smile at nothing while staring at unfinished sums, Beatrice said, not unkindly. You may take your time deciding what you want, Eleanor. No one is rushing you, least of all me, but do not waste the time pretending to yourself that you feel nothing at all. That particular lie has never suited you. Eleanor set down her pen and allowed herself, finally, a moment of honesty. I do not know what I feel. He hurt me, Aunt Beatrice, more deeply than I let myself admit even to you. And yet last night, watching him stand in that room looking genuinely sorry, genuinely changed, I found myself wanting to believe him far more than caution should have allowed. Then perhaps, Beatrice said gently, the answer is not to decide everything at once, tonight or tomorrow, but simply to let him prove himself over time, as any sensible woman would demand of any man asking to be trusted again. Words are easy in candlelight. Let us see what he does in the plain, unflattering light of ordinary days. Eleanor found comfort in that counsel, and resolved, as she returned to her figures with somewhat steadier hands, to guard her heart carefully, while remaining honest enough with herself to admit that some quiet, hopeful part of it had already begun, cautiously, to open. The first letter from Julian arrived exactly 1 week later, precisely as promised, and true to his word it contained nothing beyond news of the tenants. The Hargrove family had moved into their finished cottage. The youngest daughter had lost a tooth and worn the gap in her smile like a badge of honor. The Eastern Fields drainage had finally been repaired according to the plan outlined in Eleanor's old notebook. There was no plea for her return tucked between the lines, no attempt to press for more than she had offered. Eleanor read it twice, and to her own quiet surprise, found herself smiling at the image of a small girl proudly displaying a missing tooth to a duke who had once believed such details beneath his notice. She did not answer immediately, but she did not discard the letter either, tucking it instead into the drawer of her small writing desk, where, over the following weeks, it would not remain alone. Neither Eleanor nor Julian could yet predict what the coming months would bring, only that something between them had shifted, quietly and irrevocably, in the space of one difficult conversation by a tall, candle-lit window. Lord Edmund Cole arrived at Harlington Hall unannounced, dropped into the nearest chair without waiting for an invitation, and delivered the sort of news that made Julian's stomach drop before a single word had fully registered. There is talk in London, Edmund said, that you mean to marry Charlotte Vane. Julian stared at his oldest friend as though the man had begun speaking in an unfamiliar tongue. I mean to do nothing of the sort. Where has such a rumor come from? From Charlotte Vane's own family, apparently, who seemed rather determined to make the rumor true through sheer repetition. Edmund accepted the glass of brandy Julian poured without being asked, entirely at home in a house he had visited 100 times before. It seems Miss Vane's mother has been telling anyone who will listen that her daughter has secured the attention of a duke through diligent service, and that an announcement is expected shortly. I thought you would want to know, given the alternative attachment I understand you have been quietly nursing these past months. Julian sat down heavily, the brandy forgotten in his hand. He had dismissed Charlotte Vane from her position weeks earlier, gently and with a generous reference, once it became clear that her role at Harlington Hall had never truly suited either of them. There had been nothing between them beyond professional courtesy, certainly nothing that could reasonably be mistaken for courtship, and yet rumors, once loosed into society, cared little for such distinctions. This is absurd, Julian said. I have exchanged perhaps a dozen words with the woman since her departure. Absurd or not, it has reached Ashcombe, Edmund said grimly, and Julian's blood went cold. I heard it myself, from a acquaintance who has connections there. If Miss Whitmore hears such talk before you have the chance to correct it. Julian was already on his feet, calling for his horse before Edmund had finished the sentence. He rode through the night, arriving in Ashcombe well past the hour any respectable caller should have appeared at Beatrice Whitmore's boarding house, and found, to his mounting dismay, that the rumor had indeed traveled ahead of him. Beatrice met him at the door with an expression considerably colder than the frank assessment she had offered him at the assembly weeks earlier. You have some nerve, Your Grace, arriving at this hour. I need to speak with Eleanor. It is urgent. She does not wish to see you. Beatrice did not move from the doorway. A letter arrived yesterday from a cousin in London, informing her of your supposed engagement to your former companion. She has said very little since, which in my niece generally means a great deal is happening beneath the surface. Julian felt something in his chest tighten unbearably. There is no engagement. There has never been anything between myself and Miss Vane beyond employment, ended weeks ago on entirely amicable terms. The rumor is false, spread by a mother eager to elevate her daughter's prospects through gossip rather than fact. That may well be true, Beatrice said, but you must understand how it appears from where my niece stands. She opened herself, cautiously, to the possibility of trusting you again, after months of careful letters and small proofs of your sincerity. And now the first substantial rumor to reach her suggests you have simply replaced her with someone new, exactly as you once threatened to do in your own study. You can see, I hope, why she might find that particularly difficult to bear. Julian closed his eyes briefly, the full weight of the irony landing on him with physical force. He had spent months trying to prove he understood the damage those words had done. You are easily replaced, and now, through no fault of his own conscious choosing, circumstance had conspired to make those very words seem prophetic. Please, he said, let me speak with her. 5 minutes. If she wishes me to leave after that, I will go, and I will not trouble her again unless she writes to me first. Beatrice studied him for a long moment, weighing something in her expression that Julian could not quite read, before finally stepping aside. 5 minutes, Your Grace. And if I hear her raise her voice even once, I will have you removed from this house myself, Duke or no Duke. Eleanor sat by the window of her small room, a single candle burning low on the desk beside her, the offending letter from her London cousin still open where she had left it. She did not turn when Julian entered, though she must have heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard Beatrice's low voice granting him passage. You should not have come, she said quietly. I heard the rumor reached you before I could correct it myself, and I could not bear the thought of you believing it, even for a single night. Julian remained near the door, unwilling to press further into the room without invitation. There is no truth to it, Eleanor. I dismissed Charlotte Vane from her position weeks ago. Nothing beyond ordinary courtesy ever passed between us. Her mother has apparently decided to manufacture an engagement out of sheer ambition, and the gossip has traveled further and faster than the truth ever could. Eleanor finally turned to face him, and the raw hurt visible in her expression struck him harder than any words could have. Do you understand what it felt like, she said, reading that letter? For one entire night, I believed you had done to me again exactly what you did the first time, that I had allowed myself to hope, cautiously, carefully, against every instinct telling me to guard myself better, and that hope had been foolish after all. I understand, Julian said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised even himself. I understand, because I have spent this entire ride imagining precisely that pain on your face, and it has been unbearable to me in a way I did not expect. You cannot simply ride through the night and undo an entire evening of believing myself foolish for trusting you, Eleanor said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. No, Julian agreed. I cannot undo the evening. But I can tell you, plainly and without any further games or careless words, exactly what I want, so that no rumor and no misunderstanding can ever again leave room for doubt. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance from her chair. I do not want Charlotte Vane, or any other woman who might competently fill a position at Harlington Hall. I want you, Eleanor Whitmore, not as a companion, not as someone whose worth I measure against how smoothly my household runs, but as a woman I have come, over these long and difficult months, to love more than I ever properly understood while you were simply present and unappreciated in my own home. The words hung in the small room, and Eleanor sat very still, searching his face for any trace of the careless cruelty that had once lived so easily behind his eyes, and finding, instead, only an earnestness that seemed to cost him something significant to offer so plainly. You cannot say such things lightly, she said finally, her voice unsteady now, in a way that had nothing to do with anger. I am not saying them lightly. I have never in my life meant anything more seriously. Julian knelt, slowly, until they were level with each other, an act of humility that would have been unthinkable from him a year earlier. I know I have no right to ask this of you, not after what I said to you, not after months of leaving you to wonder whether my regret was sincere or simply convenient, but I am asking anyway, because I would rather risk your refusal than spend one more day pretending I do not love you entirely. Eleanor's composure finally broke, tears rising unbidden as months of careful guardedness gave way beneath the weight of a confession she had not quite dared to hope for. You hurt me, she said, more deeply than you likely understood. Even now, I do not forgive easily, Julian. I do not trust easily either, not anymore. I do not ask for easy forgiveness, he said. I ask only for the chance to earn difficult trust, slowly, over as much time as you require, without any pressure or expectation beyond what you are freely willing to give. Downstairs, Beatrice listened from the base of the staircase, her ear tilted toward the low murmur of voices above, and though she could not make out every word, something in the tone reassured her enough that she did not, in the end, need to remove the Duke of Harlington from her house that night. When Julian finally descended the stairs, well past his allotted 5 minutes, his eyes were suspiciously bright, and Beatrice studied him with an assessing look that had softened considerably from the coldness with which she had greeted him. "Well?" she asked. "She has not forgiven me," Julian said honestly. "Not entirely. Not yet. But she has agreed to let me try to earn it properly, in whatever time it takes, without expecting anything beyond what she chooses to offer freely." Beatrice nodded slowly, something like approval settling into her expression. "That, Your Grace, is considerably wiser than anything you managed to say the last time I spoke with you. Perhaps there is hope for you yet." Julian rode back to Harlington Hall as dawn broke over the fields, exhausted and aching from a night without sleep, but lighter in his chest than he had felt in longer than he could properly remember, carrying with him not a certainty of Eleanor's love, but something perhaps more valuable still, her willingness to let him try to deserve it. The following weeks tested that willingness more thoroughly than either of them anticipated. The rumor of Julian's supposed engagement to Charlotte Vane, once loosed upon polite society, proved stubborn in its refusal to die quietly. Mrs. Vane, emboldened by her daughter's brief and entirely unremarkable employment at Harlington Hall, continued to speak of an impending announcement to anyone who would listen, and the gossip spread through London drawing rooms with the particular relish reserved for stories involving dukes and unexpected romance. Julian addressed it directly, writing a formal and unambiguous letter to Mrs. Vane requesting she cease spreading falsehoods regarding an engagement that did not exist, and following it with a brief, public correction delivered through a mutual acquaintance well placed to ensure the truth traveled as widely as the original rumor had. It was not comfortable for him, airing such a private matter for public consumption, but he understood, finally, that half measures and quiet hopes would not undo the damage already done to Eleanor's trust. Only clear, visible action would begin to repair it. Charlotte Vane herself, when she learned of her mother's fabrication, wrote Eleanor a brief and mortified letter of her own, assuring her that no such engagement had ever been discussed or intended, and that she found her mother's ambitions on the matter as embarrassing as they were unwelcome. Eleanor read the letter with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering wariness, uncertain how much of her caution belonged to the rumor itself, and how much simply to old wounds that a single night's confession could not fully close. She did not write back to Julian immediately. She allowed herself instead the time Beatrice had counseled weeks earlier, watching from a careful distance to see whether his professed devotion would survive contact with ordinary, unglamorous days, rather than the heightened emotion of a midnight confession. It did. Letters continued to arrive weekly, precisely as promised, filled with the small details of tenant life she had once tracked so carefully herself: a wedding among the staff, a good harvest in the western fields, the Hargrove family's youngest daughter learning her letters at last under the patient instruction of the village schoolmaster, Mr. Henry Voss. Julian never once pressed for more than she offered in return: content, or at least appearing content, with whatever brief replies she chose to send. He also, she learned through Colette Farrow's occasional letters, had begun making genuine changes to how the estate was managed, changes that extended well beyond the immediate crisis of the fire. He met personally with tenant families rather than relying entirely on written reports. He had established a proper fund for household emergencies, informed by the very notebook Eleanor had once kept in secret, unrewarded diligence. He had, Colette wrote with evident satisfaction, become considerably easier to work for, less prone to the careless cruelty that had once defined his worst moments. Eleanor read these accounts with a slowly warming heart she was careful not to examine too closely, wary of hope that might yet prove premature. But as autumn deepened into winter, and Julian's letters remained steady, honest, and entirely free of any pressure toward reconciliation beyond what she was willing to offer, she found her guardedness softening by degrees she had not consciously chosen. It was Beatrice, in the end, who finally pushed the matter toward its resolution, growing weary of watching her niece read each new letter with poorly disguised longing, before folding it carefully away into a drawer that had grown considerably fuller over the preceding months. "You are going to sit in this room reading his letters for the rest of your natural life," Beatrice said one evening, with the particular exasperation of a woman who had run out of patience for careful caution. "Or, you are going to write back something more than polite news of the harvest, and let the man know where he actually stands." "I do not know where he actually stands," Eleanor admitted, "nor where I stand, entirely, if I am honest." "Then perhaps it is time to find out properly, rather than corresponding at this careful, bloodless distance forever." Beatrice softened her tone, sitting beside her niece, and taking her hand in a rare gesture of open affection. "I have watched you these past months, Eleanor, and I have watched him too. on the few occasions he has troubled to visit. Whatever he was before, he is trying now, consistently and without complaint, to become someone worthy of the trust he broke. That is rarer than you might think, in a man of his position. Most would have given up the effort weeks ago, once the initial guilt faded and pride reasserted itself. Eleanor considered her aunt's words carefully, turning the most recent of Julian's letters over in her hands, tracing the familiar shape of his handwriting, steadier now than the anxious scrawl of his very first apology. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly. "Not of him precisely, of myself, of how much I want to believe this is real and lasting, and how much that wanting could blind me if I am not careful." "Wanting something does not make it foolish to pursue," Beatrice said gently. "It only becomes foolish if you refuse to look honestly at the evidence before you. And the evidence, from where I sit, suggests a man who has spent nearly a year proving himself through actions rather than empty words." Eleanor sat with that thought long into the night, and when morning came, she took up her pen and began, for the first time since the assembly, a letter that offered Julian considerably more than careful news of the harvest. The letter reached Harlington Hall on a gray winter morning, and Julian's hands were not entirely steady as he broke the seal. Eleanor had written more than harvest news at last. She wrote of her fear, plainly stated, and of her cautious hope, equally plain, and she closed with a simple request that struck him with far more force than any grand declaration could have managed. She asked him to come to Ashcombe, not for another midnight confession delivered in urgency, but for an ordinary visit, in daylight, where he might see for himself the life she had built and decide honestly whether he wished to be part of it, rather than simply reclaiming the woman he had once taken for granted. Julian read the letter 3 times before he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what she was offering. Not forgiveness handed over freely, but an invitation to prove himself properly, in the unglamorous light of ordinary days, exactly as Beatrice had once warned him would be required. He arrived in Ashcombe 2 days later, not on horseback this time but in a modest carriage, dressed plainly rather than in the finery his title usually demanded, having decided, after careful thought, that he wished to appear before Eleanor as simply a man, not as a duke calling upon a woman beneath his station out of some sense of noble condescension. Beatrice greeted him at the door with considerably more warmth than his previous unannounced arrival had earned, though her sharp eyes still assessed him carefully as she led him through to the small parlor where Eleanor waited. Eleanor rose as he entered, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, the weight of months of letters and one difficult midnight confession settling into something quieter and steadier between them now. "You came," she said. "You asked me to." Julian glanced around the modest, well-kept parlor, noting the small touches that spoke of a life carefully built. Books stacked neatly on a shelf, a half-finished piece of needlework abandoned on a chair, a child's slate propped near the window, evidence of the tutoring she had mentioned in her letters. "This is a good life you have made here, Eleanor. I can see that plainly." "It is," she agreed. "I built it without you, and I am proud of that fact. I do not intend to abandon it simply because you have finally learned to value me properly." "I would never ask you to abandon it," Julian said. "I have spent this past year learning, slowly and at considerable cost, exactly what it means to value someone properly, and I understand now that it does not mean asking them to fold their life back into the shape of yours. It means finding a way to build something together that honors what each of you has become." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the old carelessness, and found instead a steadiness that had not been present in the man who had once dismissed her with 3 cruel words in his study. "And what precisely would that look like, in practice? I will not simply return to being your companion, managing your household while you take credit for its smooth running." "No," Julian agreed immediately. "That is not what I am asking, nor what I want. I have spent this year learning to manage my own household properly, with my own attention and effort, precisely because I no longer wish to depend entirely on someone else's uncompensated labor to keep my life functioning. If you were ever to return to Harlington Hall, it would not be as a companion managing my affairs. It would be as my wife, my equal in every meaningful sense, with your own interests and pursuits honored, rather than absorbed entirely into service of my convenience." The word wife hung in the small parlor, and Eleanor felt her breath catch despite months of careful preparation for exactly this possibility. "That is a significant step beyond letters and apologies," she said carefully. "It is," Julian acknowledged. "I do not offer it lightly, nor do I expect an answer today, or even this month. I have learned, I hope, that trust rebuilt hastily is not truly rebuilt at all. I am prepared to wait as long as you require, to continue proving myself through action, rather than words alone, for as long as it takes you to feel certain of what you want." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Julian, watching her, felt the particular vulnerability of a man who had finally offered everything he had and could do nothing further but wait for her answer in her own time. "I have conditions," Eleanor said finally. "Should I ever agree to such a step?" "Name them." "I will continue tutoring, whether at Harlington or elsewhere. I have found genuine purpose in it, and I will not give it up simply because it does not fit neatly into the role of a duchess." She held his gaze steadily. "I will have my own allowance, entirely separate from household funds, so that I am never again dependent on anyone's goodwill, for the basic dignity of my own resources. And you will never again, under any circumstances, speak to me or of me as though I were replaceable, not in anger, not in jest, not even in the smallest careless moment. If you cannot promise that absolutely, then we have nothing further to discuss." "I promise it," Julian said without hesitation, "not because it is easy to promise, but because I have spent a year understanding exactly what those words cost you, and I would rather lose my own tongue than speak them to you again." Eleanor's careful composure finally cracked, something warm and hopeful breaking through months of guarded caution. "You have changed," she said quietly, wonderingly, as though only now fully believing it. "Truly changed, not simply performed regret to win me back." "I have tried," Julian said. "Whether I have succeeded is not truly for me to judge. That judgment belongs entirely to you." They talked for hours that afternoon, without urgency, without the pressure of grand declarations, simply two people rebuilding something honest between them, piece by careful piece. Eleanor told him, for the first time in full, exactly how the years at Harlington Hall had worn on her long before that final cruel morning. The small dismissals she had swallowed, the birthdays and illnesses she had tracked out of genuine affection while receiving barely a passing acknowledgement in return, the quiet, accumulating weight of being essential and invisible at once. Julian listened without interrupting, without defending himself, simply absorbing the full shape of what his carelessness had cost her over years, not merely in the single moment that had finally broken her patience. "I did not understand, until you left, how much of myself I had given without ever being asked properly," Eleanor admitted. "I do not intend to make that mistake again, with you or with anyone." "I would not want you to," Julian said. "Whatever we build together, I want it built on what you choose to give freely, not on what habit or duty leads you to give without thought." Julian met, over the following weeks, with the innkeeper's daughter Eleanor, tutored, praised the child's progress with a genuine warmth that surprised even Eleanor, who had half expected performance rather than sincerity. He spoke with Beatrice at length about the boarding house's accounts, offering practical suggestions without any hint of condescension toward work he might once have dismissed as beneath his notice. He did not press for an answer. He simply continued showing up, week after week, through the remainder of a long winter, proving through unglamorous consistency exactly what his letters had promised. The winter was not without its difficulties. In late January, a fresh crisis arose at Harlington Hall, a dispute among the tenant families over grazing rights that threatened to turn genuinely bitter, the sort of matter that would once have seen Julian dismiss the complaints entirely and leave the details to whoever happened to be managing his correspondence. Instead, he wrote to Eleanor honestly, describing the dispute and admitting he was uncertain how best to resolve it fairly, without simply imposing his authority and calling the matter closed. Eleanor could have refused to advise him, could have insisted the matter belonged entirely to his own household now. Instead, she wrote back a careful, thoughtful response, drawing on years of quiet observation about which families held old grievances against each other and why, suggesting a compromise that acknowledged both sides without favoring either. Julian implemented her suggestion nearly word for word, and the dispute resolved itself within a fortnight, the tenant families genuinely satisfied rather than merely silenced. It was a small thing, in the scope of an entire winter, but it taught them both something important, that whatever shape their future together might take, it would not require Eleanor to abandon the judgment and care that had always been genuinely hers, nor would it require Julian to pretend he no longer needed her counsel simply to preserve some fragile notion of independent competence. There was one difficult evening in February when Lady Augusta, visiting Harlington Hall and growing impatient with her nephew's continued uncertainty, pressed him directly on his intentions. "You have been riding to Ashcombe every week for months," Augusta said bluntly, over dinner. "Society has begun to notice, Julian, and not always kindly. Either declare your intentions properly or stop making a spectacle of yourself and the poor woman both." "I have declared my intentions," Julian said. I asked her to marry me in November. She has not yet given her final answer, and I do not intend to press her for one before she is ready." Augusta's sharp expression softened, surprised admiration replacing her earlier impatience. "You have learned patience, then, somewhere along the way." I confess I did not expect that particular lesson to take root in a man raised to expect the world's compliance with his every whim. "I learned it the hard way," Julian said simply, "by losing the one person whose patience I had never properly earned in the first place." Augusta said nothing further on the matter, though she watched her nephew with an expression of quiet, genuine pride that had been entirely absent from their earlier conversations about Eleanor Whitmore. It was Eleanor, in the end, who finally decided the matter was settled, on an ordinary afternoon in early spring, watching Julian help the innkeeper's daughter sound out a difficult word with more patience than she had ever witnessed from him toward any tenant matter during her years at Harlington Hall. "I have an answer for you," she said, once the child had gone, and Julian turned to her with an expression that carried more vulnerability than she had ever seen on a duke's face. "Yes? Yes," Eleanor said simply, and watched relief and joy break across his features in equal measure. "Not because you are a duke, and not because Harlington Hall offers comforts this boarding house cannot, because you have spent a year proving, patiently and honestly, that you understand exactly what you once threw away, and because I believe, finally, that the man standing before me now would never again mistake my devotion for something owed to him, rather than freely given." Julian crossed the small distance between them and took her hands in his, careful and reverent in a way the cold, dismissive man from his study a year earlier could never have managed. "I love you, Eleanor Whitmore, not the companion who managed my household, though I am endlessly grateful for everything you gave that role. I love the woman who shut a door on me, rather than accept being called replaceable, who built an entire life from nothing, rather than simply waiting for my regret, who has enough self-respect to demand conditions, rather than simply accepting whatever I chose to offer. And I love you," Eleanor answered, her voice steady despite the tears rising in her eyes. "The man you have become this past year, not the one who spoke those cruel words. I hope, for both our sakes, that man remains buried permanently beneath the one standing before me now." "He will," Julian promised. "I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain of it." Their wedding, held the following autumn at a small church in Ashcombe, rather than the grand cathedral tradition might have demanded, was modest by the standards of Julian's title, but rich with everyone who had witnessed the long, difficult journey to that day. Beatrice, radiant with satisfaction at having predicted the outcome months earlier, Colette Farrow, who wept openly through the entire ceremony, and even the Hargrove family, whose youngest daughter served as an enthusiastic and only slightly clumsy flower girl, proudly displaying the gap where her lost tooth had finally grown back. Lady Augusta Price, seated in the front pew, leaned toward her nephew before the ceremony began and murmured, with the dry satisfaction of a woman who had watched the entire transformation unfold, "It seems, Julian, that some things truly cannot be replaced, no matter how hard a foolish man might try." Julian, watching Eleanor walk toward him in the pale autumn light, dressed simply and entirely herself rather than performing any expectation of grandeur, found he could not disagree with a single word. She stopped before him, and for a moment, the memory of a slammed study door and 3 cruel words hung between them, acknowledged, and finally, fully forgiven. "Ready?" she asked, the faintest echo of dry amusement in her voice, the same tone she had once used to unsettle him across a study desk piled with correspondence. "I have been ready," Julian said, "since the moment you shut that door and taught me exactly what I stood to lose." The vicar began the ceremony, and outside the small church, spring flowers Eleanor had planted herself in the churchyard garden bloomed in quiet, unassuming color, evidence of a life built patiently, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms, now finally shared, by her own free choice, with a man who had spent a year proving himself worthy of standing beside her, rather than simply above her. After the vows were spoken, the small gathering moved to the boarding house Beatrice still kept, transformed for the afternoon with simple garlands and long tables set beneath the open sky, far removed from the grandeur Harlington Hall might have offered but rich in a warmth no ballroom could have matched. Mr. Henry Voss, the village schoolmaster, offered a toast, praising Eleanor's tutoring of half the village's children, drawing laughter and genuine affection from every corner of the gathering. The innkeeper's daughter, now reading fluently thanks to months of patient instruction, presented Eleanor with a hand-drawn card covered in carefully practiced letters, and Eleanor's tears at the sight of it surprised no one who had watched her build this life from nothing over the preceding year. Julian stood back from the celebration for a moment, watching his wife move easily among people who loved her not for her title or her usefulness but simply for who she had chosen, freely and deliberately, to become. He thought of the cold study at Harlington Hall, of 3 careless words spoken in a moment of wounded pride, and understood, with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that he had very nearly thrown away the finest thing he would ever be given. Eleanor found him there, apart from the crowd, and slipped her hand into his without a word. "Regretting the quiet wedding already, Your Grace?" she asked, dry amusement warm in her voice. "I imagine London society expected considerably more spectacle from a duke's marriage." "London society can imagine whatever it likes," Julian said, drawing her closer. "I have exactly the spectacle I want, standing right here beside me." Beatrice, watching the pair of them from across the garden with Colette Farrow at her side, allowed herself a rare, satisfied smile. "I confess I had my doubts about him, in the beginning," she admitted. "As did we all," Colette said, raising her glass slightly. "But watching a man properly earn something, rather than simply demand it, has a way of changing one's opinion entirely." The celebration carried on late into the golden spring evening, laughter and warmth filling a garden Eleanor had built with her own hands, in a life she had built with her own quiet, determined strength, now shared freely with a man who had finally learned, through loss and patient effort both, exactly what it meant to treasure, rather than take for granted, the people who chose, each day, to stay. Snow was falling over Harlington Hall the morning Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Harlington, found her husband standing once again in the small room that had once been hers alone, though it no longer sat empty as it had during those long, difficult months of separation. "You are thinking too loudly for this early in the morning," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "I could hear it from the hallway." Julian turned, a faint smile crossing his face at the sight of her. A full year into their marriage now, and still capable of unsettling his composure with nothing more than her presence in a doorway. "I was thinking of Charlotte Vane, actually." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "An unusual subject for a snowy morning. I received a letter from her yesterday. She has taken a position with a family in Bath, and writes that she is finally happy in work, that suits her particular talents, far better than managing tenant disputes and correspondence for a household that never truly needed her the way it needed you." Julian set the letter aside. "I find I am glad for her. She deserved better than to be measured constantly against a woman she was never given fair notice she would be compared to." "That is generous of you," Eleanor said, crossing the room to join him by the window. "I have had considerable practice this past year, learning generosity I did not previously possess." He wrapped an arm around her, and together they looked out over the snow-covered grounds, the eastern cottages visible in the distance, rebuilt now for over a year, and home once more to families who had nearly lost everything through his negligence. "I still think of the fire sometimes, of how close we came to genuine tragedy, simply because I refused to value what you offered until it was taken from me." "You have more than made amends," Eleanor said gently. "The Hargrove family speaks of you now with genuine warmth, not merely dutiful respect. That is not nothing, Julian." Their days had settled, over the preceding year, into a rhythm neither of them could have predicted during those bitter months of separation. Eleanor continued her tutoring, now expanded into a small school she had established on the estate grounds for the children of tenants and staff alike, a project Julian had funded without hesitation and attended, more often than either of them expected, simply to watch her teach. Her own allowance, exactly as she had demanded, remained entirely separate from household funds, a small but meaningful assurance of independence she had never possessed during her years as an unpaid, unacknowledged companion. Julian, for his part, had become a different sort of landlord entirely, from the man who had once dismissed tenant concerns as beneath his notice. He met personally with families rather than relying solely on written reports, kept his own careful notes rather than depending entirely on someone else's diligence, and had established, in Eleanor's honor, though he rarely admitted it aloud, a fund specifically dedicated to preventing exactly the sort of oversight that had once cost the Hargrove family their home. Lady Augusta visited often that first year, watching the transformation of both her nephew and his household with evident satisfaction, though she never entirely abandoned her sharp tongue. "I confess," she told Eleanor one afternoon, over tea in the drawing room, "I did not expect my nephew to prove capable of such genuine change. He was, for most of his life, rather too comfortable in his own arrogance to imagine anyone might rightfully demand better of him." "He surprised me too," Eleanor admitted, "though I confess I nearly did not give him the chance to prove it." "And what changed your mind, in the end?" Augusta asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Eleanor considered the question carefully. He stopped trying to convince me with words alone, and simply kept showing up, week after week, proving through consistency what any number of eloquent apologies could not have proven alone. I have found, in my experience, that a person's true character reveals itself not in a single dramatic gesture, but in what they choose to do, quietly and repeatedly, when no grand audience is watching. Colette Farrow, now housekeeper of a household she scarcely recognized from the cold, careless place it had once been, found herself equally struck by the change that had settled over Harlington Hall. Staff who had once whispered nervously about the Duke's temper now spoke of him with cautious but growing respect. The kitchens no longer produced meals that tasted flat with absent care, because the household itself no longer felt hollow at its center. Beatrice visited twice that year, once for the wedding and once again in midsummer, and found her niece thriving in ways that eased whatever lingering worry she had carried through the long months of Julian's courtship. "You look well," Beatrice said, watching Eleanor move through her small schoolroom, correcting a child's careful letters with the same patient attention she had once applied to the Duke's tangled correspondence. "Better than well. You look like a woman who chose her life rather than simply enduring it." "I did choose it," Eleanor said. "Every part of it. That has made all the difference." Beatrice studied her niece for a long moment, satisfaction settling into her weathered features. "I am proud of you, Eleanor, not for marrying a duke, though I confess that has its own practical advantages. I am proud of you for demanding, plainly and without apology, exactly what you deserved before agreeing to give anything further of yourself. Too few women learn that lesson before it costs them dearly. You learned it and made him pay the proper price for nearly losing you before you gave him a second chance." The following spring brought news that filled Harlington Hall with a different kind of joy entirely, when Eleanor discovered she was carrying their first child. Julian's reaction, when she told him, surprised her with its rawness. A man usually so composed reduced briefly to tears he made no effort to hide, kneeling before her with his hands pressed gently to where their child was beginning to grow. "I will not make the mistakes with our children that I nearly made with you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They will never doubt, for a single day, that they are treasured rather than simply useful." "I know," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet wonder, that she believed him completely. Their daughter was born in the depths of the following winter, during a snowstorm that kept the household anxious and awake through a long night of waiting, and Julian held his newborn daughter for the first time, with hands that trembled far more than they had during any tenant crisis or fire recovery he had managed over the preceding 2 years. "She has your eyes," he told Eleanor, exhausted and radiant in equal measure. "I am glad of that. I hope she inherits your judgment as well, and considerably less of my own early foolishness." "She will learn from both of us," Eleanor said, "as all children do. I only hope we teach her, from the very beginning, that her worth is never measured by how quietly she serves others, nor how easily she might be replaced by someone more convenient." They named her Margaret, after no one in particular, simply because Eleanor found the name gentle and strong in equal measure, fitting for a child born into a household that had learned, through considerable hardship, exactly what it meant to value people properly, rather than merely using them until convenience demanded otherwise. Years later, when Margaret was old enough to ask about the small leather notebook her mother still kept carefully in a drawer of the estate's study, Eleanor would tell her, gently and honestly, the story of a door once shut in anger, and a duke who had very nearly lost everything worth having before he understood, at last, that the people who care for us quietly, without demand or complaint, are never truly replaceable at all. "What happened to the notebook?" Margaret would ask, turning its worn pages with careful curiosity. "Your father kept it," Eleanor would answer, smiling at the memory of a man who had once believed such careful attention beneath his notice. "He said it taught him more about running this household and about loving properly than anything else he ever learned in his life." I believe in the end he was entirely right. Charlotte Vane wrote once more, some years later, to share news of her own upcoming marriage to a solicitor in Bath, and Eleanor found herself genuinely pleased to reply with warm congratulations. Any earlier awkwardness between them long since dissolved into simple mutual goodwill. It struck Eleanor, reading Charlotte's letter, how strange the whole affair now seemed from a distance, that a young woman's ambitious mother and a careless rumor had nearly cost her everything she had eventually built with Julian, and how differently things might have unfolded had she allowed fear and old wounds to close the door permanently rather than simply cautiously. Lord Edmund Cole remained a frequent visitor to Harlington Hall in the years that followed, and often teased his old friend about the transformation he had witnessed firsthand. I remember the man who once told me marriage was a practical arrangement, nothing more, and love a distraction unsuited to a man of your position, Edmund said one evening, watching Julian carry his young daughter on his shoulders across the drawing room, while Eleanor laughed at some joke Margaret had made in her small, serious voice. I confess I do not recognize that man in you any longer. Thankfully, Julian said. Neither do I. The eastern cottages, rebuilt now for several years, had become something of a symbol within the household, a physical reminder of the cost of neglect and the possibility of genuine repair. Julian made a point, every autumn before the dry season, of personally inspecting the hay stores and outbuildings himself, a small ritual that cost him little time but meant a great deal to the tenant families who had once suffered for his carelessness. The Hargrove family's eldest son, now old enough to work alongside the estate's laborers, often joked that the Duke inspected the hay stores more thoroughly than any steward in the county, a habit born, everyone understood without needing to say it aloud, from a lesson learned at considerable cost. Eleanor's small school continued to grow, eventually educating children from families well beyond the estate's own tenants, and she took particular pride in watching students who had once struggled with their letters grow into confident young readers, writers, and thinkers in their own right. She never once regretted stepping away from her role managing Julian's household affairs, understanding now, with the clarity of hard-won experience, that her truest gifts had always been better spent on work chosen freely, rather than duty quietly assumed. On the anniversary of the night she had shut the study door and walked away from everything she had known, Eleanor and Julian made a small, private tradition of sitting together in that same study, sharing a quiet dinner just the two of them, a deliberate act of remembrance rather than avoidance. It was Julian's idea, offered gently in their second year of marriage, a way of honoring rather than hiding from the painful history that had ultimately led them to something far more honest and enduring than the arrangement that preceded it. I do not wish to pretend it never happened, he told her, that first anniversary evening, refilling her glass with the careful attention he had learned to offer freely rather than grudgingly. I would rather remember exactly how close I came to losing you, every year, than risk ever forgetting the lesson it taught me. Eleanor found she agreed entirely, and so the tradition continued, year after year, a quiet ritual of gratitude for a door that had once closed in justified anger, and had, through patient effort and genuine change, finally opened again, into a life neither of them could have imagined during those bitter, uncertain months of separation, a life built not on what one person owed another through duty or convenience, but on what two people, having learned the cost of taking each other for granted, chose freely and deliberately to give each other every single day.